Hello, my name is Dr. Beth Dillard, and this is Linguistics for Educators. So this is the first of two videos devoted to the topic of first language acquisition. Please keep in mind this is just a brief overview of the field. You can certainly dig more deeply into multiple aspects of this topic. In the first video, the current video, I'm going to give you a lay of the land, sort of an overview, and then we're going to look at historical perspectives on how children learn their first language. And these are widely discredited at this point in time. Then in the follow-up second video, we're going to look at current views of how children learn their first language or first languages in cases of children growing up in multilingual homes. So before we get started, I want to bring to your mind a few terms that you may or may not be familiar with. The first is the term utterance. And Wikipedia actually has a really nice definition. It is, in spoken language analysis, an utterance is the smallest unit of speech. It is a continuous piece of speech beginning and ending with a clear pause. So let's take this example. Let's say in speech I might say, I'm talking to a friend of mine. So yesterday I ate sushi with some other friends. It was all so delicious. The tuna was my absolute favorite. So if we wrote that down, it would look like this. The thing about the utterance is it often lines up with what we think of as punctuation in a sentence, so commas, periods, etc., but not always. So take this. What about if somebody asks me, hey, would you wash the dishes? And I said, sure. So then, in speech, we say things like this all the time. There's tons of these one-word responses, right? So does a subject always need a subject and a verb? We could have lots of conversations about that. But in spoken language, this is pretty typical to have these types of utterances. So in this case, sure would be one utterance. Now the other term is ungrammatical. And ungrammatical is a term we would use to talk about an utterance. So it's an utterance that is ungrammatical when it doesn't follow the rules of grammar of that particular language. And we mark this with an asterisk at the beginning of the utterance, like this. So let's say a child said, I goed to the store. Now in standard American English, we would say, I went to the store. And so because this child is experimenting with that ed ending, they're putting it onto the verb. They're saying, I goed to the store. And so we would mark that as ungrammatical. Now we could have an entirely other and important conversation about how certain language forms become standardized and others do not, and how that is related to power and social dynamics. But for the purpose of this video, we're just going to use this particular definition of ungrammatical to mark some of the utterances that we might use as examples. Okay, so getting into some of the original theories of first language acquisition. There have been multiple theories about how children learn their first language or languages. The earliest theories were based around imitation of adult language and reinforcement of so-called correct child language by adults. These theories were really kind of common sense theories that superficially make a lot of sense when we think about child language. But both have been now widely discredited because of their lack of ability to take into account the complexity of language and language acquisition. Now you're going to see aspects of both of these theories in the theory of behaviorism, which in general is this idea that learning, including language learning, happens through responses to stimuli. And we're going to talk about these in just a minute. Now, since Chomsky's critique of behaviorism as an explanation for language acquisition in 1959, scholars from the fields of linguistics, developmental psychology, sociology, anthropology, education, neuroscience, I'm sure I have forgotten somebody, have really investigated the mechanisms behind first language acquisition. And so in the second video that follows this one, we're going to go into more detail about the major findings from these studies. So let's go into a little detail about these historical ones. So imitation theory. So just in definition, it is exactly what it sounds like. So it's this idea that children learn language through imitation. So there's evidence in favor of it. Think about, any kids that you have in your life or that you've observed in classrooms, and young children that are at the very beginning of acquiring language. So we're thinking, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds. They do tend to mimic the language of the adults and children around them. So this, on the surface makes sense. And another piece of evidence in favor of imitation theory is that when you look at kids, they learn the language spoken by the community around them. So one could imply that, well, of course, they're imitating the people around them. So these are evidences in favor of the theory. There's plenty of counter evidence, though. So how to explain utterances like this ungrammatical phrase, which I marked in the wrong way. He drived the car. So a child is probably not going to be hearing a parent say he drived the car. They're going to be hearing he drove the car. And yet here the child produces the ungrammatical he drived the car. We also, with imitation theory, can't really explain how individuals create novel utterances. If all they're doing is mimicking what other people are saying, how is it that they come up with sentences, with ideas, with utterances that put together words in ways they've never heard anybody else say? And so for these reasons and others, this theory is now discredited. Another theory is reinforcement theory. So in general, the idea of reinforcement theory is that children learn language via this cycle of positive reinforcement. So they say it, quote, right. They say the correct way. They receive praise. They say it wrong. They get corrected. And through that cycle, they start to take on and keep using those structures, those words that are that they receive positive reinforcement for. And so let's take this example. And this comes from Freeman and Freeman's book, Essential Linguistics. So the child points to the dog, they say, "That's a dog," and they're praised. The parent responds, "Yes, that is a dog. You can pat the dog." On the other hand, let's say the child points at the dog and says, "That's a dog." The parent, according to this particular theory, would respond and say something like, "That is a dog." Say, "That is a dog." And so the parent would call attention to the ungrammatical portion of the child's utterances. Now, in favor of this, we can see that parents do sometimes praise certain language forms and provide correction for others. But what we also see, though, is parents don't always do this. And typically parents, they're building that relationship with their child. And so what they do is they're focusing on the meaning in what their child is saying. And they're trying to make sense of what it is their child is trying to communicate to them. And so for this reason, this theory is also now discredited. Both of these then came, not together in a sense, but you can find elements of them taken up within behaviorist theory. So in general, behaviorism is simply this idea that a stimulus leads to a response. Behaviorism is a theory that has tried to explain many aspects of human behavior, not just language acquisition. So take the classic example. This comes from Pavlov's work with dogs. And so Pavlov worked with some dogs to build up this idea called classical conditioning. So a dog, any of you who have a dog know that if you put food in front of your dog or a treat they really like, they're going to start to salivate or lick their lips, that kind of thing. But then what he did is then every time he put food in front of the dog, he also rang a bell so that he would condition the dog to associate the food and the bell and lead to that physical response of salivation. Well, then eventually he removed the food, rang the bell, and the dog would still salivate. And so this was the stimulus of the bell now leading to a response of salivation, which would have normally only happened if you had put food in front of the dog. So Skinner then argued that behaviorism could explain language acquisition. Now, just as kind of a fun joke, if you think about behaviorism, we could also make these arguments that it goes in both ways. So in this cartoon, the dog is saying, "Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book." And so you can take this idea that while you are training your dog, say to associate a command with an action, say sitting goes with a treat. And eventually, sitting goes with just the command, which my dog has a long way to go on that. But they sometimes train us a little bit as well. And we get associated with their behavior, and then we get into patterns of how we respond as well. Okay, so like I was saying, Skinner argued that this theory could explain language acquisition as well. He did work in 1957. He wrote a really influential book about this, and he made the case that children learn their first languages through this more general process of stimulus and response. So, for example, a child might babble something that the parent interprets to be dada or mama. The parent smiles. They're so excited. Their child has started talking. They said my name. They pick up the child. They coo at the child. They smile to the child. And all of this positive reinforcement makes an association for the child between that specific sound that they just made and getting a parent's attention. So you can see in this that it includes aspects of imitation and reinforcement theory. So at the same time that behaviorism was kind of being accepted as an overall explanation for child learning, then within the field of linguistics, structural linguistics was using behaviorism to try to make sense of language learning. And structural linguistics argued that children acquired language by learning regularly occurring sentence patterns through a process of stimulus and response. And so that children were able to start picking up on sentence order, in a sense, and different patterns through what they were hearing in their environment and then what they would produce and receive positive reinforcement for. Now, Chomsky in 1959, he critiqued this idea in general, specific to Skinner, but also more generally. And he argued that this couldn't work, that Skinner's theory really couldn't explain the complexity of language or the language acquisition process. And he, along with others, have provided a lot of counter evidence. And this is true not only for behaviorism as an explanation for first language acquisition, but also for second language acquisition and aspects of learning in general. Here I'm just going to speak specifically about first language acquisition. So one of the things that we noticed, and Lynn first pointed it out, is children, no matter their environment, with some exceptions, do tend to learn to speak at roughly the same time and in roughly the same way. And the argument here is that if learning language was so dependent upon one's environment that you wouldn't expect to be so much similarity, you would actually expect a much wider range than we tend to see in these variables of when one learns to speak. Another critique, people say, well, what about other animals? What about apes? If truly only imitation and reinforcement worked, why is it that apes don't learn to speak? And of course, here I'm not speaking of, we do have amazing examples of particular primates learning some sign language. But still, what we see is still different in manner from what humans tend to pick up. We also see that child language is rife with ungrammaticality. And so this goes back to the earlier idea of mimicking language, of imitation theory. And so they're not mimicking necessarily what they're hearing in their environment, because typically children are hearing grammatical structures. And the final thing is that children learn language remarkably